Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this week's Business in 2021 webinar presentation. My name is Kathy Purdy, and I'm a marketing manager at Schoeneck King. I'd just like to go over two quick housekeeping items before we get started. Please enter your questions using the Q&A box located at the bottom of your screen, and we will do our best to answer those as time allows throughout today's program. Once the webinar has ended, we would appreciate it if you would take a moment to complete the survey. Your comments and suggestions for future topics are important to us, and we do share those with our panelists. So it is my pleasure to introduce today's moderator, Adam Mastrolio.
Kathy, thank you so much. And as always, thank you to everybody for taking some time out of your day to spend with us during our weekly webinar. We're going to do things a little bit different today, given the recent news and the issue of the Delta variant. So today we're only going to have three presentations. The first is going to deal with changes to the unemployment process. After that, Katie Anderson is going to do her update. And I'm going to spend about a half an hour going over mandatory employment vaccination policies and issues surrounding those types of policies, things you should consider if you're thinking about implementing one of those. So let's get right started, or let's get right into it. We have a lot to cover. First up is Mallory Campbell. Mallory is an attorney in our New York City office, and she's going to give us an update on the unemployment process. So Mallory, please take it away.
All right, thanks, Adam. So over the past year or so, we've seen a lot of changes with New York's unemployment insurance program. At the start of the pandemic, we saw that increase in the amount of weekly benefit provided to each individual. So first was that extra $600 under the CARES Act, which has expired. Then we had an additional $300 under President Trump's executive order. This also expired. But then again, we saw $300 extra a week that's set to expire this September. We also saw an increase in the number of weeks individuals can collect unemployment benefits and a relaxing of the eligibility criteria to collect unemployment, particularly for those individuals who are self-employed or independent contractors. So these changes were all enacted by federal law and through federal programs, and they're all set to expire on September 5, 2021. More recently, in January 2021, the New York State Department of Labor Commissioner issued an order that canceled all charges against employer accounts retroactively back from March 9, 2020 until further notice. So the big thing about this is that it means that employers' experience ratings would not be impacted. This cancellation of charges is tied to Governor Cuomo's declared state of emergency. The cancellation of charges applies to all employers. So before, self-insured nonprofits would receive 50% of relief for unemployment charges under the CARES Act. So this new order bumps up the relief to 100% retroactively starting in March 2020. We don't really know how the reimbursement procedure will work for the self-insured nonprofits who had to pay the 50% from March 2020 until January, but we will keep you up to date on that. More recently though, what I want to get into is that Governor Cuomo signed a pair of bills into law on July 16, 2020, that creates a new system for calculating partial unemployment benefits. So the previous system notated how many days per week an employee would work. If an employee only worked 1 day per week, the employee would receive 3/4 of his full weekly benefit rate. If an employee worked 2 days per week, they would receive half their weekly benefit rate. If an employee worked 3 days per week, the employee would receive 1/4 of the full weekly benefit rate. And if an employee worked 4 days of work or more in a week, the employee would not be entitled to any benefits. The problem with this old system was that it was very limiting. Even if an employee worked only 1 hour on a given day, this was counted as a day worked and would reduce the employee's weekly benefit rate accordingly. So if an employee worked 1 hour on Monday, 1 hour on Wednesday, that counted as 2 full days worked, and they would only receive half their weekly benefit rate. The new system will base partial unemployment benefits on a worker's weekly earnings and hours worked. Under the new system, the total number of days of employment in a week is calculated by adding the total number of hours worked and rounding it to the nearest whole number. An important note is that no hours over 10 on any given day will be counted. After you add up the total number of hours, if the total is less than or equal to 10, then no day of employment has occurred. If 10 to 16 hours, then this equals 1 day. If 16 to 21 hours, then this equals 2 days of employment. If 21 to 30 hours, then this equals 3 days of employment. And then more than 30 hours per week is 4 days of employment. So the new system disregards a portion of the part-time earnings and then begins to reduce benefits by $1 for each dollar of earnings up to the full weekly benefit rate. So as long as an individual is working less than 30 hours in a week and earning less than $504, then that individual will be entitled to unemployment insurance benefits. The full reforms will take effect by April 2022 at the latest. In the meantime, the New York Department of Labor is required to implement an interim fix that allows individuals to work for up to 10 hours a week without any reduction in their part-time unemployment benefits. The interim fix will take effect in mid-August. And we'll be sure to keep everyone up to date on this, but that's all I have in the meantime. So I'll hand it back to Adam.
Mallory, thank you so much. There's a lot changing, obviously, with respect to unemployment benefits. So thank you for keeping us updated. All right, next, we're going to turn to Katie Anderson to provide her weekly update. I know Katie has a lot to talk about today. She and I were talking earlier this morning about all of the new developments that she has to report on. So Katie, please take it away.
Yes, I do have a lot to report on today. We had the classic thing happen again this morning where I finished the slides, sent them over to Kathy about 9 o'clock this morning. And then since then, we've had two major breaking news items. Let's start with breaking news items that's not related to COVID. The investigation into the governor by the Attorney General was published. It is a 168-page report. It is, I obviously haven't been able to read it all. I only have been able to look at it since 11 o'clock. But in it, the Attorney General concludes, and I'm going to read to you directly from the report, the conclusion. Upon completion of our independent investigation into allegations of sexual harassment brought against Governor Andrew Cuomo and the surrounding circumstances, we have reached the conclusion that the governor sexually harassed a number of state employees through unwelcome and unwanted touching, as well as making numerous offensive and sexually suggestive comments. We find that such conduct was part of a pattern of behavior that extended to his interactions with others outside of the state government. We also find that the executive chamber's response to allegations of sexual harassment violated its internal policies, and that the executive chamber's response to one complainant's allegation constituted unlawful retaliation. In addition, we conclude that the culture of fear and intimidation, the normalization of inappropriate comments and interactions, and the poor enforcement of the policies and safeguards contributed to the sexual harassment, retaliation, and overall hostile work environment in the executive chamber. So that is all very much a big deal. And I'm sure we're going to see a lot more happen with this as the day and week goes on. I'm sure I'll have a lot more to say to you about it next week. So turning then to COVID, we continue to see this increase in cases that are really contributable to the Delta variant. The other major breaking news component is about New York City requiring proof of vaccinations, and I will be discussing that in a little bit. But continuing to look at what's happening with the cases, this is all from the New York Times. This is all New York data. Looking at our hospitalization rate, it's continuing to increase. You're continuing to see the number of cases increase quite dramatically. We've seen a 158% increase over the past 14 days. But the positive news here is that we are also seeing the vaccination rate increasing as well. So if we could go to the next slide, please. The vaccination rate is going up quite a bit. You're seeing all of these states are showing everybody is going to go get a shot right now. The US yesterday reached the 70% vaccination goal, which is 70% of adults, so people 18 and older, have received at least one shot. It was a month later than what the president had said that he wanted it to be, which was July 4th, but we've reached it. But at the same time, we're also seeing really huge outbreaks. Remember last week I went through the states that have low vaccination rates and looking at their numbers. Well, Florida and Texas don't have great vaccination rates. And we've seen that they have had 1/3 of all of the cases, COVID cases in that time. For New York, I'm happy to say that we've seen these numbers jump in the past week. Everyone has at least gone up by 1 percentage point. Others have gone up by 2 percentage points. So happy to see that we have 69% of those 18 and older in New York State fully vaccinated. And that in terms of all New Yorkers, we have 57% fully vaccinated. That will continue to be a number that we watch closely, especially with schools coming. So this is the map from the CDC. This map shows which counties are considered to be at a high risk or substantial risk for transmission of COVID. Remember last week we went over the CDC's recommendation, which says that if you are in one of these areas, then you should be, even if you're fully vaccinated, you should be wearing a mask indoors. A reason for this is people who are vaccinated may not have symptoms, but may be spreading COVID. And that's dangerous for immunocompromised people, especially, but also for people who aren't vaccinated, think children. So it's 23 counties in New York State that meet this requirement or meet this threshold. But New York is largely not going to be doing much with that. It is going to be a county by county thing. So if your county is on either the high or substantial list, I strongly suggest that you just keep your eye out to see what your county is saying, see what your local leaders are saying about whether or not a mask mandate will be re-implemented. Additionally, the governor has said that there will not be another statewide mask mandate because localities must decide. Ultimately, this comes down to the governor's decision to end the state of emergency at the end of June. The governor really can't issue the same executive orders that he could previously. He could direct the Department of Health to issue emergency regulations, but especially given what just came out today, I don't see him making dramatic moves. He is really trying to push the responsibility for this wave of the pandemic off onto the legislature, saying that that's their job to determine whether or not people are going to have to wear masks statewide. And if the legislature won't do it, then localities must do it. New York City is not going to have a mask mandate, according to the mayor, but New York City, as of 10 o'clock this morning, has announced that they will require proof of vaccination for indoor dining and fitness. I would not be surprised if we see that increase in popularity, especially as we get into the fall, especially as we see school start. We're going to see, I think, a lot more of these vaccine mandates, which, you know, we're going to hear about quite in detail from Adam in a little bit. Erie County has issued a mask mandate for their all county buildings. Their county executive did say that they may be implementing more this week. So I would keep your eyes out if you're in Erie County. Monroe County, we did also see a mask mandate come up that says that county employees in public and common areas have to wear a mask at all county operated facilities. So I think we're going to see this continuing to happen. Really keep your eyes out for your local place, because that's going to really be important. In addition, like the New York City vaccine mandate, the governor suggested that private businesses should be instituting vaccine mandates. Again, remember, the governor doesn't have really, he doesn't have the power right now to say every single person in New York necessarily can go get a vaccine. So they're really relying on private businesses to do this. And this goes along with New York City's mandate now that says that in order to get into a fitness center or a restaurant in New York, that you're going to have to be fully vaccinated. I think we're going to see a lot more of these come up. I know Adam's going to go into great detail on this, but this will really be something to be watching out for, especially in, what's going to be very hard about this phase of the pandemic is in the beginning phase, we were receiving everything from a top-down level, right? We were receiving everything from the governor. It may not have been clear, but it was clear where it was coming from, where the directives were coming from. At this point, we are scattershot dealing with it. So you will have to really be looking at your local governments. We will continue to monitor local government actions as well. But this is really going to be a new and tough phase of the pandemic. So with that, I'm going to kick it back to you, Adam.
Well, Katie, before you sign off, I just have a couple of questions that I've been getting a lot, and I know you have too, and I'd like to clear them up for those attending today. First of all, all private businesses have to get their HERO Act plans prepared this week and finalized this week. Have you been hearing anything, any scuttlebutt that the state may activate those plans, which right now are dormant until they are activated?
I have not heard anything that the state is going to activate those plans, but I don't think it's a far off possibility at this point that they will. That's, in the fall, especially. Just looking at the projections for what's happening with the Delta variant, looking at this new contagious variant that's happening in Florida as well. That's developed. I don't think it's outside of the realm of possibility that the HERO Act will be activated to deal with COVID. And that would also fit in well with the scattered shot approach I was just talking about, right? It wouldn't be an edict necessarily from the governor's office. It would be that you are responsible now by law to enforce this. So I do think that there's a very good chance that we're going to see the HERO Act applied this year at some point.
Thank you. All right, and one last question for you, and this is more me just confirming with the audience. If a private business wants to implement a mask policy, so they want to say on their own volition, if you come to my store or if you're going to work here, you got to wear a mask, that is permissible, correct?
That is correct. Absolutely. That's been consistent throughout. It's the equivalent of no shoes, no shirt, no service. Just add one more in there and you got it. Or take, if you wanted to take shoes off, I guess you could, but that would be gross to add mask on there. But I don't recommend doing that.
Well, thank you. I just wanted to clear that because I know that the CDC guidance has caused a lot of confusion about what's required versus what's recommended. So that's something to keep in mind as a business. If you want, you can impose a mask requirement for employees and or visitors. So Katie, with that, thanks so much. As always, please, if you have questions on any of these issues for Katie or I, please put them in the Q&A and we'll do our best to get to them. All right, so now we're going to turn to the topic that I have been getting the most questions about from clients, and that is employer vaccine mandates. I've given a number of webinars on this topic, but they were before the Delta variant was raging. So I think this question is starting to come up more and more often. And I thought it would be a good idea to go over some of the principles that are important for you as employers and business owners to consider when you're thinking about a vaccine mandate. So with that, we'll get right into it. The first question that I get asked all the time is, are these employer vaccine mandates legal? And I put that word in quotation marks for a reason. So we look at a number of things to determine whether or not some type of employment policy is legal. First of all, in the case of vaccine mandates, we look to our historical context. We've seen vaccine mandates be approved and upheld in the medical context in the past. We haven't seen much of that outside of the medical context prior to the COVID pandemic. So that's something we look at. We also look at guidance from the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, which is the federal agency tasked with enforcing federal anti-discrimination laws. We look at court cases, we look at opinions, and I'm going to talk about some that are very recent and helpful for employers who are considering this issue. I'm going to talk about the emergency use authorization and how that impacts the decision about whether to mandate the vaccine. and also any OSHA issues that you might come across as well. Finally, we'll talk about bargaining issues on this question about whether or not vaccine mandates are legal. So let's get right into it. Next slide, please. Okay, so as I mentioned, in the historical context, mandatory flu vaccination policies have been upheld. However, courts have stated that if a hospital or medical provider is going to have a flu vaccine policy, that employer has to be able to provide accommodations for medical and religious reasons, absent undue hardship to the provider. So we know that those types of mandates have been upheld. There has been very little outside of the healthcare context. Early on in the pandemic, we saw this case from California involving a flu vaccination policy for the University of California system. The court in that case upheld the vaccination policy, but again, that was the flu vaccine, that wasn't the COVID vaccine. Next slide, please. So then we look to the EEOC. What has the EEOC said about mandatory vaccination policies? They've actually been very helpful. So the EEOC, like I mentioned earlier, is the agency that is tasked with enforcing federal anti-discrimination statutes. Some of the relevant federal anti-discrimination statutes are shown on your screen. The Americans with Disabilities Act, Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, and the Genetic Information Non-Discrimination Act. So the ADA prevents or restricts an employer's ability to require medical examinations and make disability-related inquiries. This was a big deal when the vaccine first came out because employers were thinking, well, how can we implement a mandatory vaccination policy? We're going to be forcing employees to get something stuck in their arms and a substance put into them. The EEOC came out in December and said, that's okay. Requiring vaccination is not a medical examination. So the EEOC cleared that hurdle as it relates to the Americans with Disabilities Act. It also cleared that hurdle as it relates to Title VII and GINA, and said that those statutes were not implicated with mandatory vaccination policies. Next slide, please. More recently, the EEOC came out with guidance. If there was any confusion about their statement in December, they clarified it. And I put the quote directly from the EEOC guidance right on the screen there. Federal EEO laws, and that's the Americans with Disabilities Act, Title VII, GINA, do not prevent an employer from requiring all employees physically entering the workplace to be vaccinated for COVID-19, subject to the reasonable accommodation provisions of Title VII and the ADA and other EEO considerations. So the EEOC came out and said, mandatory vaccination policies do not violate these federal EEO laws. So that's very helpful. Next slide, please. However, as noted in that statement I just read, if an employer is going to put in place a mandatory vaccination policy, they also have to have a procedure by which employees can request accommodations for medical and or religious related reasons. So the ADA accommodation issues that the EEOC discusses in its guidance are that you have to provide reasonable accommodations, and you can't exclude somebody from the workplace unless there's no way to provide a reasonable accommodation absent undue hardship. So what I would say to employers is that this process just requires you to go through your normal interactive process that you would with anybody who is requesting an accommodation for any medical reason. It's no different in the vaccination context if you are mandating the COVID vaccine. The guidance also talked about termination versus exclusion from the workplace and how those two things are different. It really made clear that exclusion from the workplace is one, it's an extreme remedy, but termination is the most extreme remedy, and it's something you should try to avoid if at all costs. Next slide, please. Now, again, the same issues apply as it relates to religion. You have to have the opportunity for employees to request accommodations for sincerely held religious beliefs. This, of course, raises the issue of what is a sincerely held religious belief. The cases interpreting Title VII talk about two different things. if something is an actual religious belief, and then whether or not it's sincerely held by the employee. The EEOC guidance is fairly strongly tinted toward the employee and says that you should ordinarily assume that a belief is reasonably or sincerely held and religious unless you have some reason not to. And in that case, you can request additional information. Again, the same reasonable accommodation process is in place. You go through the interactive process, you ask questions, and you determine if an accommodation is available. If an accommodation is available, you have to provide it unless that accommodation would cause you an undue hardship. So those are some accommodation issues. Next slide, please. The EEOC guidance also provides employers with some examples of what could be potential accommodations for employees who cannot get the vaccine due to medical or religious reasons. So here are some of the listed potential accommodations: wearing masks at all times, working at a social distance, working a modified shift. Importantly, I do want to point out that getting periodic tests for COVID-19, because that is something that employers, I think we've seen New York State adopt this, that it's going to mandate state employees to be vaccinated, or if they're not, they're going to have to be tested frequently. So this is something the EEOC has acknowledged as a specific accommodation for those who cannot get vaccinated. Employees could be given the opportunity to telework, or as a last case scenario, accept a reassignment. So these are some of the examples that the EEOC gives, and I think they're good as potential accommodations for those who cannot get vaccinated. Next slide, please. All right, I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about this issue because it is the issue that has really caused lawyers the most problem, I should say, for the last 6 or 7 months. Since the first vaccines were granted emergency use authorization in December of 2020, lawyers and businesses have struggled with this question. How can we mandate a vaccine that's only in circulation under an emergency use authorization? So by way of background, the emergency use authorization procedure is authorized by statute, and it is a way for vaccines and other medical products to get out into circulation during an emergency without first receiving full approval by the FDA. So as many of you are aware, medications, medical devices, things like that have to go through an FDA approval process. It's a long process. It takes time. And in a pandemic, that's not necessarily helpful where we need to get medication products in circulation quickly. So this emergency use authorization procedure was put into place in the early 2000s. One of the problems with the EUA procedure is that the statute says that those individuals receiving a vaccine pursuant to an EUA have to be given the option to refuse or accept it. So we as lawyers read that statute and we say, wait a second, how can we mandate a vaccine if somebody has the option to refuse or accept it? So that's been a stumbling block for the past 7 months. I should say that this stumbling block has been chipped away gradually. And if you could go to the next slide, please, I'll talk about a couple of things that have helped employers who are thinking about these mandatory vaccination policies. First of all, we have seen court challenges to mandatory vaccine policies, and we've seen courts reject this argument about the EUA. So, for example, I listed the Houston Methodist Hospital case. That's from a month or two ago. You had employees of the Houston Methodist Hospital who challenged the mandatory vaccination policy. One of the arguments they advanced was, you can't make us get this vaccine, employer, because it's only available pursuant to an EUA. The court in Texas rejected that argument completely and actually had a good quote in their decision, in which they said, an employee, has the right to accept or refuse the vaccine. They're not, the hospital's not making the employee get the vaccine. However, if the employee chooses not to get the vaccine, then they can choose somewhere else to work. So the district court in Texas completely rejected that EUA argument. Most recently, last week, we saw this decision, or a couple weeks ago, we saw a decision from the Seventh Circuit on Indiana University's mandatory vaccination policy. In that case, the employees and students who were challenging the policy also made the argument regarding the EUA. And in that case, the court also rejected that argument regarding the EUA. So we've now seen federal courts in two different areas of the country, Texas and Indiana, who have rejected this EUA argument. Now, really recently, we got an opinion from the Department of Justice, an opinion letter. It's an 18-page opinion letter that goes into great detail about whether or not the EUA prohibits employers from mandating the vaccine. And the Department of Justice gives a very nice opinion, a very well-reasoned opinion, and they conclude that the EUA process does not prohibit employers from mandating the vaccine, which is very important. So now we have court cases saying that this EUA argument isn't a valid argument for those challenging vaccine mandates. We then see the Department of Justice saying that the EUA argument is not a valid argument. So this thing, or this stumbling block that lawyers, businesses have dealt with over the past 7 months is gradually becoming less and less relevant. Now, I will say this, the two court cases I've cited and the Department of Justice opinion letter are not completely dispositive. And what I mean by that is it doesn't resolve the issue entirely, but it's looking more and more like it's not an issue. And I will say this, once any of these vaccines that are currently under an EUA, the Johnson & Johnson, Moderna, or Pfizer vaccines, once they receive full FDA approval, whenever that is, this EUA issue goes away completely. So it is removed entirely as a stumbling block for employers considering vaccine mandates. Next slide, please. Okay, so we talked about federal EEO laws, which the EEOC said are not a bar to mandatory vaccination policies. We looked at the EUA issue, which is becoming less and less of an issue for employers considering vaccination policies. Now I want to talk briefly about OSHA. OSHA has not come out and said employers can or cannot mandate the vaccine. OSHA's guidance documents has encouraged vaccination, but has not gone so far as to mandate or say you cannot mandate. There's one issue that I would highlight, which I don't think is a significant issue, but it is out there, is this whistleblower protection section of OSHA, section 11C, which says that an employee with a medical condition who refuses vaccination because of a reasonable belief that that shot could lead to serious illness or death may be protected from retaliation. So the way it would work would be this. The employee says, I'm not going to get vaccinated because I have a reasonable belief that the vaccines are not safe. Now, at this point, that argument is not a strong argument and is not supported by medical evidence, and it would be very difficult for an employee to make that argument. This was more relevant in the early stages of the vaccine in December, January, February, when it was first coming out, and there wasn't as much data on the potential side effects and the rate of side effects. So I think that this is a much less significant issue now, but I wanted to raise it for you just so you're aware of it. Next slide. Another issue that you should consider if you're a unionized workforce is that mandatory vaccination policies are most likely mandatory subjects of bargaining. So we have the NLRA, which has been interpreted to require bargaining over mandatory vaccinations, absent contract language addressing this issue. And the NLRB decision that addresses this was in the nursing context and dealt with the mandatory flu vaccination policy. The NLRB found that a mandatory flu vaccination policy was a mandatory subject of bargaining and therefore had to be bargained before it could be implemented. I would say this, if you have a collective bargaining agreement in place and a unionized workforce, look at your collective bargaining agreement. Look at the management rights clause. Look at your health and safety clauses. there might be language in there from which you can say, we have the ability to impose this mandatory vaccination policy without bargaining. I would say just look first before you engage in bargaining, check those clauses, see if there's anything else in the contract that might give you the authority to implement such a mandate without bargaining. Also look at your history. If you have implemented these types of mandates before, absent bargaining, that's something relevant as well. So take a look at that. Next slide. Okay, so here are some additional practical issues that I think are worth mentioning and worth considering. First of all, there are additional legal challenges that are pending throughout the United States. So I mentioned the Houston case, I mentioned the Indiana University case. There are other cases like the Legarreta case in New Mexico, which is it was a corrections officer challenging a mandatory vaccination policy. Again, the EUA issue was raised in that case, but we don't have a decision from the court. So, I've cited to the two cases that have come out so far. We might start seeing other cases that go in a different direction. So we have to keep an eye on that. We will obviously let you know if there are additional challenges that are decided that are relevant to this issue. Now, there are also issues to consider regarding potential employer liability. What if you as the employer mandate the vaccine, your employee gets the vaccine, would not have gotten the vaccine absent your mandate, and then develops an adverse reaction? Does that fall within workers' compensation? Because you have now made it mandatory for work. They got it because of your mandate. Is that now a workers' comp claim? We haven't seen this yet, but in theory, it sounds like it would be. Disparate treatment claims here. This is an interesting one and something I'll talk a little bit more about in just a minute. This is where you have employees who are now going to be requesting accommodations. What if you grant an accommodation to one employee and you don't grant an accommodation to another? You as the employer are potentially opening yourself up for disparate treatment claims. You treated me differently than you treated someone else based upon a protected characteristic that I have. Whether you do or not, I'm just saying it opens you up to a potential claim for disparate treatment. Next slide, please. Okay, some other, we've been looking at legal issues associated with employer vaccine mandates. Here are some practical issues for you to consider. What does your workforce do? So if you're an employer with a lot of public-facing employees, it might make more sense for you to have a vaccine mandate in place to protect your employees. If you have employees who primarily sit behind a desk, don't interact with people, then it might not make as much sense. So for example, we saw Disney announce last week that it is going to be mandating the vaccine for all quote unquote cast members or its employees, and they are public-facing employees. And this is probably one of the considerations that went into their decision to implement that policy. Another consideration is what percentage of your workforce is vaccinated. To the extent you don't know, you can ask, but if you have a workforce that's already 85, 90% vaccinated, then it might not make sense for you to implement a mandate because you're not really going to be helping or you're not going to be significantly improving or increasing the safety of your workplace. Other issues to consider. How will your policy be implemented? What are you going to do? Are you going to require proof of vaccination to be submitted? Who will it be submitted to? What form will it be submitted in? Who will be responsible for monitoring? These are things to think about as you're considering whether or not to implement a mandatory vaccination policy. And then this last one, I think, is an important one. Are you really going to take action against the top performer? So you have this vaccine policy in place. What if your top performing employee comes to you and says, look, I'm not going to get vaccinated. I don't have an excuse. I don't have a medical or religious justification. I'm just not going to do it. Are you going to fire that person? And these are things you need to think through before you implement your policy. Next slide, please. All right, so here are some, I meant this as a spectrum of options for you. On one end of the spectrum, you have no action. So you don't take any action with respect to vaccination. You don't do anything. You don't acknowledge it, nothing. As you get further along in the spectrum, you encourage vaccination. or you incentivize it, going a little further. You could administer it on site. You can offer a benefit subject to some issues that we can talk about. Then you go further along on the spectrum, you mandate proof of vaccination, which is in effect a vaccine mandate. And then the furthest I think you could go is to mandate vaccination administered on site by you or your contractor. This is also an option. Next slide, please. If you are going to implement a mandatory vaccination policy, I have some suggestions for you. First of all, you need a written policy. They're not complicated. We've done them for many clients, but you need to have a written policy. That policy has to have some information in it. What proof you're going to require, how it's submitted to whom, that you're going to provide paid leave for vaccination as you're required to by law, that you are going to offer accommodations, and importantly, that this policy is subject to change. So there are really important things you need to put in this policy. Those are some of them. You also need to have a very clear accommodation process in place. So how are accommodation requests going to be submitted? What do they look like? We recommend using specific forms. Who are they going to be submitted to? And what is the process going to be for considering those requests and or granting accommodations? Employees have to be made aware of what your process is going to be, how it's going to be implemented, and what they can do to request accommodations. Next slide, please. All right, I'm going to close with a couple of FAQs that we've been getting. First of all, can an employer require an employee to show proof of their receipt of the vaccination? Yes. So the answer is yes. And we got this answer from the EEOC guidance. However, I would point out this point that's in the second and third bullets here. Don't ask for anything more. Only ask for proof of vaccination. Or if you're going to ask yes or no, ask yes or no, have you been vaccinated? Don't go any further into why. The EEOC has said that if you go further, for example, if you ask why someone's not going to be vaccinated, you are now getting into protected health information that would trigger the ADA protections against reasonable or against medical inquiries. So when you're requesting proof, just request proof, just ask yes or no, don't go any further. Next slide. We talked briefly about vaccine incentives. I can't really cover this all right now. We've had people on this webinar to talk about vaccine incentives prior, but essentially vaccine incentives are permissible. However, they are considered wellness programs. And there are limitations on wellness programs under HIPAA, under the ADA and GINA. There are also other ADA requirements that are mentioned here. You have to make sure that you're applying these policies consistently or these incentives consistently. You have to have options available for those who cannot get vaccinated due to medical or religious reasons. So those are the view from 50,000 feet is vaccination incentives are permissible, but you need to speak with your attorney about the particular plan that you're considering or the incentive that you're considering. Next slide, please. All right, so if an employee cannot get vaccinated because of their disability or sincerely held religious belief, it may be lawful for you to exclude the employee from the workplace. So I say this with caution. This doesn't mean that you can automatically terminate someone because you have to really look at whether or not a reasonable accommodation exists. We went over some of the reasonable accommodation options, but you really need to look at whether those options exist before you take any adverse action against somebody. Okay, so that is the end of my presentation. We have a lot of questions. I obviously have not been able to go through them, but what we will do, as we do every week, is we will take those questions and we'll try to look at them and provide some answers next week during the weekly webinars. So with that, I will end, and I thank everybody for attending. I hope this was helpful. You know, there's a lot changing at the moment, and we will be sure to provide you with up-to-date, up-to-the-minute updates like Katie gave you this morning on the report regarding the governor. So thank you all for being here. We look forward to seeing you next week. Take care.